It is the appointed hour. So some of you know me. I'm David Tamayo. I'm the executive board of the Freedom from Religion Foundation and co-founder of Hispanic American Freethinkers. At this convention, you've heard quite a bit about the threat of white Christian nationalism to personal liberties and our democracy. We invited Stephen Levitsky to help us put our struggles in defending the principle of state-church separation in the full context of what he calls America's descent into authoritarianism. I always have a problem with that word. Our speaker's background is of special interest to me as Latino. He is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government and director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard, that little school in the Northeast. He is a senior fellow at the Kettering Foundation and a senior democracy fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Among the 13 or so books he has written or co-written is How Democracies Die, which was a New York Times bestseller and published in 30 languages. It was followed by the book Tyranny of the Minority, Why American Democracy Reached the Breaking Point. He's currently working with a colleague on a book about democratic resilience across the world. So, and as a side note, before I introduce him, a reminder that this session will be followed by a cash bar at 6 p.m. and a ticketed dinner at 6:30 in the Hilton Ballroom, second floor. Professor Levitsky will be signing books, signing copies of How Democracies Die and The Tyranny of the Minority in the foyer. After dinner, please return to this room here by 8 for our concluding speaker. So please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen Levitsky, who will be speaking on the Great Abdication, America's Descent into Authoritarianism. Let's welcome him.
Thanks, everybody. I thank you so much for the invitation. It is a great honor to be here. I don't think I've been surrounded by this many atheists since my bar mitzvah. I have only one complaint. Why in God's name, why in nature's name did you schedule me to follow Jamel Bouie? That guy is so smart. There's no way, this is not gonna be a good look for me. There's no way that I can rival what just preceded me. Okay, political scientists have discovered two seemingly rock-solid facts about democracies. First of all, rich democracies never die. The wealthiest democracies in the history of the world ever to break down, Argentina and Hungary, had a per capita GDP of about $20,000 in today's dollars. The United States is 4 times richer than that. The second seemingly rock-solid fact about democracies is that old democracies never die. No democracy over the age of 50 has ever broken down. Even if we date the birth of U.S. democracy at 1965, when we achieved full suffrage, U.S. democracy is over 50. So no democracy even remotely as old or as rich as the United States has ever broken down, not once in the history of the world. So we ought to be safe. And yet we are not safe. U.S. democracy is breaking down right before our eyes. Now, to be clear, I don't think the United States is descending into fascism or single-party dictatorship, although I think there's a good argument can be made that the MAGA movement shares a lot with fascism. What we are living through and what we are descending into is not fascism. It's closer to what Luke and Wei and I call competitive authoritarianism. Competitive authoritarianism is a political system in which parties compete in elections, but in which systematic incumbent abuse of power tilts the playing field against the opposition. In other words, governments don't ban the opposition, they don't eliminate elections. They weaponize state institutions, government institutions, and they deploy them to punish critics, to weaken rivals, and to bully the media and civil society. That's what autocrats did in Russia, in Venezuela, in Turkey, Hungary, El Salvador, and it's what Trump is doing today. At the heart of competitive authoritarianism is weaponization of the government. And the first step here is always to capture the referees. Virtually all elected autocrats purge key government agencies of professional civil servants and pack those agencies with loyalists. Trump has done just that. He has purged and packed the Justice Department, the FBI, the Defense Department, intelligence agencies, Homeland Security, the IRS. He has packed regulatory agencies like the FCC and the FTC. He's even packing the Army, slowly. Once key government agencies are in the hands of loyalists, they can then be weaponized and deployed in ways that subvert democracy. Two critical ways that subvert democracy. The first, most obvious, is to use weaponized government institutions to punish critics through, for example, targeted persecution. All elected autocrats, any elected autocrat I've ever seen, will use his Justice Department, public prosecutors, intelligence agencies, tax authorities to investigate and prosecute rivals, very often for petty infractions, for minor tax code violations, or for mortgage fraud. No, this is straight out of the playbook. The Trump administration rolled out politically motivated, targeted investigations with stunning speed. Dozens of Trump's critics and opponents are now under investigation. We're just in year one. Jim Comey, John Bolton, Letitia James, New Jersey Congresswoman LaMonica McIver, all of them have been indicted. Others, like Adam Schiff, appear to be on the way. The Department of Justice is investigating Act Blue, one of the Democratic Party's main fundraising platforms. It's investigating the Open Society Foundation, one of the leading funders of civil society. It's going after major Democratic Party donors, as well as pro-democracy organizations like Indivisible, one of the main sponsors of the No Kings rallies, all in the name of combating what the government increasingly calls domestic terrorism. Now, victims of selective prosecution don't have to end up in jail for it to be problematic. The investigation itself is a really powerful form of harassment, right? Targeted individuals often have to spend down their savings on lawyers. They get distracted from their jobs and their families for weeks, even months at a time. Sometimes they have to leave their jobs, and in many cases, their reputations are pretty seriously damaged. In addition to prosecuting its critics, the government is going after the media. The FCC has launched investigations into PBS, NPR, and other networks. Trump has filed defamation suits against ABC, CBS, Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. The administration has blacklisted law firms with ties to the Democratic Party. It's launched investigations into dozens of universities and illegally stripped top universities, including mine, of congressionally approved research funding, and is threatening, and this is relevant to you guys, to withdraw tax-exempt status from progressive NGOs. So individuals and organizations across this country are getting punished for being on the wrong side of this government. So punishment is one way that a weaponized state can subvert democracy. But a weaponized state can also serve as a shield to protect government allies that engage in illegal or undemocratic acts. For example, the Justice Department could turn a blind eye to acts of political violence, things like threats against politicians, judges, election officials, things like attacks on peaceful protesters. It could decline to investigate incidents of voter intimidation. It could decline to investigate incidents of local election fraud. Trump's pardon of the January 6th insurrectionists wasn't just a massive injustice, although it was that. It was also a signal, a very clear signal, that acts of violence committed by Trump supporters will be tolerated and even protected. That's crucial. The United States experienced a pretty marked rise in political violence during the first Trump presidency. Threats against members of Congress, for example, increased dramatically. According to Mitt Romney, several Republican senators voted to acquit Trump in the wake of the January 6th attack because they feared for their physical safety if they voted to convict him. Republican senators also received death threats during Trump's cabinet confirmation hearings in early 2025. North Carolina Senator Tom Tillis said that the FBI warned him of credible death threats while he was publicly considering opposing Pete Hegseth's nomination as defense secretary. Tillis voted for confirmation. Hegseth was confirmed by 1 vote. What we've seen over the last 9 months is prototypical competitive authoritarianism, the systematic weaponization of government institutions and the deployment of those institutions to punish critics and to bully or co-opt business, the media, and civil society. So how do we know? How do we know when we've crossed the line into authoritarianism? This isn't always so easy, especially in competitive authoritarian regimes. There aren't necessarily tanks in the streets. They had not and will not cancel elections. The Constitution is still intact. So if you squint, we still look like a democracy, right, from the outside. How do we know? Let me suggest a really simple metric. How costly is it to be in opposition to the government? Right? In a democracy, legal, peaceful opposition should be virtually costless. In a democratic society, we don't have to think twice about writing op-eds against the government, donating money to opposition candidates, running for office against the incumbents, or joining or organizing peaceful protests. All of those things are legal, they're constitutional, so there's no risk of government retribution in a democracy. Under authoritarianism, by contrast, opposition always comes with a price. And that's what's happening in the United States. Government critics now know that they could be targets of government investigations. Media owners know that they may face lawsuits or investigations. Democratic Party donors know that they can and probably will at this point face IRS investigations. Law firms that work for Democrats know they can be blacklisted. Universities know they can face crippling funding cuts. NGOs know they can lose their tax-exempt status. And Republican politicians know they will face death threats, threats of physical violence if they cross Trump. There is now a clear, well-known cost to opposing the Trump administration. Hundreds of thousands of Americans who might have engaged in some form of legal opposition behavior are now at least thinking twice about it because they know there's a risk associated with opposition. As Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski put it a couple of months ago, I quote, "We are all afraid." It's quite a statement, but we are in a time and a place I certainly have not been in before. I'll tell you, I'm oftentimes very anxious about using my voice, Senator Murkowski says, because retaliation is real. This threat, the cost of opposition, the threat of retribution is now visibly changing Americans' behavior. Major law firms in Washington have now stopped doing pro bono work for progressive causes. Universities have virtually eliminated students' right to protest out of fear of government attacks. Columbia and the University of Virginia fired their presidents under government pressure. Jeff Bezos changed the Washington Post's editorial policy. CBS News has changed its editorial line and its programming. And thousands of politicians, CEOs, NGO or foundation heads, university leaders, religious leaders have begun to silence themselves because they fear possible government retribution. That suggests, at least to me, that the United States has already crossed the line into competitive authoritarianism. And it could get worse. Competitive authoritarian regimes, as I have defined them, weaponize the law. They take the existing law and they weaponize it. And that's what we've been seeing. Outright dictatorships openly subvert the law. They throw out the law entirely. And there are signs that the Trump administration is contemplating this. ISIS transformation into what is essentially a paramilitary force goes beyond anything that we've seen in, say, Hungary or Turkey or Poland. We now have masked agents in unmarked cars abducting people off the street, violating due process. And of course, the military is now being ordered to deploy in cities. Last month, as all you know, President Trump called 800 military commanders to Washington and told them to refocus their attention on internal enemies in U.S. cities. The most powerful armed forces on this earth is being told to wage what Trump called a war from within. That's Pinochet stuff. It's literally the language used by military dictatorships in South America in the 1970s. All right, so why is this happening? I want to answer that question. That's a question on all of our minds. I want to answer it in two parts. One part that focuses on the role of the Republican Party, I think that's very important, and another part that focuses on the abdication of the American elite. Let's start with the Republican Party. Individual leaders, no individual leader, not Hitler, not Pinochet, nobody, no individual leader can kill a democracy on his own. Leaders always need accomplices among mainstream politicians. And Trump has and has had the complicity of really the entire Republican Party at this point. Trump has only been able to do what he has done over the last 10 months because he has enjoyed the full, active support of the Republican Party. Republicans could have convicted Trump in the Senate after January 6th and barred him from running for office in 2024. After all, he tried to steal the 2020 election, but they acquitted him. Republicans could have abandoned Trump after 2020. After all, again, he had led a violent insurrection and tried to overturn an election, but they did not abandon him. They renominated him for president in 2024. They backed him for president despite his open authoritarianism. They confirmed nominees like Hegseth, Bondi, and Patel, even though those folks openly planned to weaponize the government and use those institutions to go after Trump's opponents. They said that's what they were going to do. And Republican politicians, to a person, have stood by silently as Trump has repeatedly violated the Constitution, prosecuted his rivals, sent troops into cities. So it's not just Trump. The entire Republican Party has turned away from democracy. How could that happen? I'm not sure that's something to cheer. How could that happen? How could a mainstream conservative party that had been competing in elections for 160 years, the party of Lincoln, suddenly turn authoritarian? In our book, Tyranny of the Minority, Daniel Ziblatt and I argue that it's fear of losing. For democracy to work, parties have to be able to tolerate losing. Nobody likes losing, but you got to be able to live with it. For parties to be able to live with losing, two conditions have to hold. First of all, parties have to know or believe that they stand a chance at winning in the future. So you lose this time, but you know you got a chance in the future. And secondly, parties have to believe that losing will not bring ruinous consequences. Right? You might bring policies you don't like, people you don't like, but it's not the end of the world when you lose. When politicians fear that they won't be able to win future elections, or when they or the constituents believe that defeat will bring catastrophe, then the stakes rise. In other words, when parties or their supporters perceive losing to pose an existential threat, they tend to radicalize and they tend to turn against democracy. We've seen this before in the United States. Think about Southern Democrats after the Civil War. Reconstruction was this country's first experiment with multiracial democracy. It brought widespread black enfranchisement. African Americans in the 1860s were a majority or a near majority in most Southern states. So their full enfranchisement terrified Southern Democrats and their supporters. Not only did black suffrage threaten the Southern Democrats' electoral dominance, it threatened the entire racial order in the South. And for many Southern whites, that felt like an existential threat. Southern Democrats responded to that perception of existential threat by turning against democracy. As one Southern Democrat put it, we cannot outnumber the Negroes, and so we must either outcheat, outcount, or outshoot them. And that's exactly what the Democrats did. They used a combination of terrorism, of violent terror, and election fraud to seize power across the South and then effectively strip the right to vote from African Americans, ushering in more than 80 years of single-party authoritarian rule in the South. Ziblatt and I argue that something similar happened to the Republican Party in the early 21st century. As you all know, the United States experienced two major changes after 1965, two major changes basically in my lifetime. First of all, a massive wave of immigration made this country much more diverse. And second, the United States began a transition to multiracial democracy, a democracy in which the rights of individuals of all ethnic groups are protected equally. That sounds pretty simple, but it's actually really hard to get to in practice. That transition, that gradual transition, generated a fierce backlash, one that has been much, much more consequential than many of us anticipated. And to understand how this reaction, how this backlash played out, we got to go back briefly to 1964. The Civil Rights Revolution generated a lot of resentment among white voters, particularly here in the South, which was overwhelmingly Democratic, big D Democratic, in the 1960s. The Republicans had been the minority party since the New Deal, but white resentment over civil rights created an opportunity for the Republican Party to expand its base. So beginning with Goldwater, continuing with Nixon, continuing with Reagan, the Republicans explicitly targeted racially conservative white Christian voters. And it worked. In a little more than a generation, a period of about 40 years, Southern whites flipped from being overwhelmingly Democrats to being overwhelmingly Republicans. The Republicans, as a result of that, became this country's party of white Christians. The Republicans have won the white vote in every election I've been alive. Every election since 1968. And because the American electorate was still overwhelmingly white and Christian in the 1970s, 80s, even 90s, the Republicans became, being the America's white Christian party, made them the dominant party, made them the majority party. The Republican Party won every presidential election between 1968 and 1988, with the exception of the Watergate election. But that strategy eventually ran into some trouble, because at the same time that the Republicans were becoming America's white Christian party, America was becoming less white and less Christian. The percentage of Americans who identify themselves as white and Christian fell from 80% in 1976 to 43% in 2016. Yeah, you guys are doing your work, I guess. That posed two threats to Republicans. The first was electoral. It became increasingly difficult for an overwhelmingly white Christian party to win national majorities in the 21st century, which is why the Republicans won the popular vote for president once between 1988 and 2024. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won 55% of the white vote and translated that into a landslide 44-state victory. In 2012, Romney did better than that. He won 59% of the white vote, but he still lost the election. When Republican leaders realized that they were winning the white vote but losing the American vote, they started to panic. In 2016, Republican Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, remember her? You do. She declared, and I quote, in 2016, she declared, "This is the last election. It's a math problem of demographics and a changing United States. If you look at the numbers of people who vote and who lives in this country and who Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton want to bring in this country, this is the last election where we even have a chance to vote for someone who'll stand up for godly moral principles. This is it." But the problem I want to suggest went much deeper than just losing elections. For much of the Republican base, this country's transition to multiracial democracy felt like an existential threat. White Christians were not just any group. For two centuries is a long time. For 2 centuries, White Christians occupied the top rung in every one of this country's social, economic, political, and cultural hierarchies. They were the politicians. They were the judges, the CEOs, the university presidents, the football coaches, the newspaper editors, the TV talking heads. All the way through my bar mitzvah, every single president, every vice president, every single Speaker of the House, every Senate Majority Leader, every single Chief Justice, every single Federal Reserve Chair, every single governor, every flippin' single Fortune 500 CEO, every Miss America, every one of them, all the way through my bar mitzvah, white. All of that is now changing rapidly, relentlessly, right before our eyes. The number of black and Latino members of Congress has more than quadrupled since my bar mitzvah, from 28 in 1980 to 114 today. For the first time in the history of this republic, the percentage of African Americans in Congress equals the percentage of African Americans in the overall population. In 1965, all 9 Supreme Court justices were white men. Today, 4 of 9 are white men. Only 6 of 9 are white. And the change extended way beyond politics. We see it in the growing presence of non-white and multiracial families on our television and movie screens. We see it in mounting societal pushback against acts of racism. Think of the Black Lives Matter protests just 5 years ago. We see it in challenges in newsrooms, in classrooms, to historical narratives that downplay or ignore this country's racist past. The early 21st century, basically my adult lifetime, saw an unprecedented assault on long-established racial and gender hierarchies. But when your group has been at the top of a social hierarchy for 250 years, challenges, especially rapid challenges to those hierarchies, can feel threatening. Losing one's dominant status can feel like an existential threat. And in fact, many MAGA voters feel like the country that they grew up in is being taken away from them. And that sense of loss has pushed many rank-and-file Republicans toward extremism. A poll taken in 2021 found that 56% of Republican voters, 56%, agreed with the statement that the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to stop it. So it's not just Trump. But Republican authoritarianism is only part of the story. The United States, as all of you know, has really powerful institutional and societal bulwarks against authoritarianism. We have the world's oldest, most successful constitution, a constitution that, for all of its flaws, has a pretty damn good track record at limiting executive abuse. We have a strong bicameral legislature, an independent judiciary, an established rule of law, and a robust system of federalism. Those institutions should protect us. The United States also has a wealthy, well-organized civil society. We've got a big, wealthy private sector. There are 900 billionaires in this country. There are, I still cannot believe this data, 22 million millionaires in this country. God, I got in the wrong profession. There are dozens of private law firms in this country that earn at least $1 billion a year in revenue. There are hundreds of independent media outlets. We have more than 1,700 private universities. We have a vast infrastructure of churches, labor unions, private foundations, nonprofits. And finally, for all of its flaws and all of its problems, the Democratic Party is much better organized, better financed, and more unified than oppositions in Russia, Hungary, Turkey, Venezuela, El Salvador, or other countries that have descended into electoral authoritarianism. So American society has more than enough muscle to blunt this authoritarian offensive. But even the best designed institutions don't operate automatically. Institutions are just pieces of paper. It's just this. They have to be defended, and they have to be used by people. And so far, America's leading public officials and our leading societal elites have been AWOL. They've been on the sidelines. Rather than actively defending our democratic institutions, they have capitulated, they have acquiesced, they have retreated to the sidelines. In other words, the people who have the constitutional authority or who have the money and the societal influence to stop this authoritarian offensive have instead stood down. There is a word for this. It's abdication. Democratic abdication occurs when those with the authority and the responsibility to defend democratic institutions fail to do so. The United States Senate abdicated when it acquitted Trump after January 6th. The Supreme Court abdicated in 2024 when it derailed the federal cases against Trump and instead granted him vast immunity. Congress abdicated its oversight role in 2024 when it confirmed openly authoritarian cabinet picks. It is abdicating in 2025 when it remains silent as Trump repeatedly violated the Constitution. Media companies like Paramount and Disney abdicated when they settled flimsy lawsuits that they could have won rather than defending press freedom. Jeff Bezos abdicated when he altered the content of the Washington Post in order to stay on good terms with Trump. Leading law firms, leading universities abdicated when they acquiesced to Trump's authoritarian demands rather than defend the rule of law and academic freedom. Business, labor, religious, and other civic leaders abdicated when they opted to remain silent in the face of blatant authoritarian abuse. This is not how you defend democracy. Donald Trump has not seized power. We have ceded it to him. We are ceding it to him. Again, our civil society is more than enough financial and organizational muscle to blunt this authoritarian offensive, but we are abdicating our responsibility to defend democracy, and that is enabling autocracy. Little political science. Abdication of this sort, acquiescence to authoritarian power grabs, arguably facilitates autocracy in two ways. First of all, it has an enabling effect. When we as a society acquiesce to authoritarian measures like, say, prosecuting critics, extorting law firms and universities, bullying media, sending troops into cities, when we acquiesce to that, we expand the authoritarian toolkit by making previously unacceptable measures acceptable. The more tools that you give autocrats, the more damage they can do. Secondly, abdication has a very powerful signaling effect. Public officials' acquiescence to authoritarian acts tells citizens that such acts are acceptable, that they're normal, that they're tolerable. When governments cross red lines without serious resistance, it normalizes behavior that was once considered, and should be considered, unthinkable. And when our most prominent billionaires and media companies and law firms and universities acquiesce to authoritarianism, it sends a message to the rest of society that resistance is futile, because if billionaires and senators and Ivy League universities can't stand up to Trump, what chance do the rest of us have? The great danger today is that we will start to silence ourselves. That fear of retribution will lead a growing number of Americans to retreat to the sidelines, to not give that speech, to not give that sermon denouncing Trump, to not run that controversial story or that critical editorial, to not join that protest, to not give money to an opposition group or candidate, to not run for office. When we all decide, out of fear, out of resignation, out of sheer exhaustion, to retreat to the sidelines, the authoritarians win. Look, it does not have to be this way. In South Korea, when President Yoon declared martial law last December, South Koreans immediately mobilized in protest. Congresspeople that night rushed to the legislature, the parliament, and literally scaled the walls of the parliament building to get inside and call a special session to annul the martial law decree. Protesters gathered outside the parliament building and helped them. Troops supporting the president tried to force their way into the assembly chamber where they're going to hold this vote, and lawmakers literally barricaded the chamber doors with sofas and benches, and they were helped. They were helped by protesters outside the building. One young woman was captured on video, went viral, tugging at the barrel of a soldier's rifle. And when the soldier finally, sort of frustrated, pulled the gun away, she shouted at him twice, "Aren't you ashamed? Aren't you ashamed?" The woman later said she thought to herself, "We have to stop this. If we don't stop this, there's nothing else." Barely 2 hours after Yoon declared martial law, 190 legislators, including members of Yoon's own party, voted unanimously to rescind the martial law. Yoon was impeached. He now stands trial for his attack on democracy. That's how you defend a democracy. In Brazil, when Trump allies Jair Bolsonaro, which the U.S. media like to call the Trump of the tropics, he had little blue and yellow make Brazil great again hats, the whole thing. He's very similar to Trump. He got elected 2 years after Trump, didn't do very well with COVID, was not very popular, lost re-election, tried to organize a coup to overturn the results of the 22 election. When that happened, the judiciary, the Supreme Court in Brazil, moved quickly and aggressively to hold him accountable for trying to organize a coup. Bolsonaro was barred from running in the next presidential election, and he was then prosecuted and convicted for the crime of organizing a coup. As one of the justices of the Supreme Court told me, we realized that we could be Churchill or we could be Chamberlain, and I don't want to be Chamberlain. So the question is, why is America's elite behaving like Chamberlain? I'm still trying to figure that out. But I think part of the story is that Americans lack a history or a shared memory of authoritarianism the way that Koreans and Brazilians and Germans and Argentines and many others do. Koreans and Brazilians reacted more quickly, more effectively to authoritarian threats because they know what it's like to lose a democracy. They've got a shared collective memory of authoritarianism. South Koreans remember when martial law was declared in 1980. They remember the repression of that era. It's burned into their collective memory. It's reinforced in popular films and novels. Brazilians remember their 21-year military dictatorship. The Supreme Court justices came of age during military rule. They call themselves the Generation of 88, in reference to the 1988 Constitution that ushered in Brazil's democratic era. They remember. Those guys took the threat of a coup seriously. As Brazilian Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes put it, when you're much more attacked by a disease, you form tougher antibodies, and you seek out a preventative vaccine. That collective memory of authoritarianism doesn't exist in the United States. Rather than remember historical abuses so as not to repeat them, Americans have a tendency to kind of whitewash our past, to put it in the closet. We don't teach ourselves very much about Jim Crow, or about lynchings, or about McCarthyism, or about the internment of Japanese Americans. Instead, we remain wedded to a myth of American exceptionalism, the belief that there's something about our culture, or our DNA, or our water that makes us immune from authoritarianism. To this day, even today, most American elites still don't believe that authoritarianism can happen here. But it can, and it is. All right, so where are we headed? Here's where I try to get a little more optimistic. I don't think we're headed to a consolidated Putin-style dictatorship. The slide into competitive authoritarianism is real, but it's really important to remember that it is reversible. It's a fairly modest descent into authoritarianism, and it is utterly, utterly reversible. It is not true that the game is up. That is utterly false. The Trump administration is pretty incompetent. It makes a lot of mistakes. It is overreaching in ways that are costing its support. That will give the opposition opportunities. Secondly, relatedly, Trump is not very popular. Autocrats can do a heck of a lot more damage when they've got 80% support than when they have 40% support. Chavez, Putin, Bukele, all of them had 80% support. Trump will never have any even remotely that level of support. His approval rating is already in the low 40s. Unpopular autocrats have a harder time consolidating power. Trump and Bolsonaro were both in the low 40s when they tried and failed to overturn elections. South Korean President Yoon, remember him? He had a 20% approval rating when he tried and failed to declare martial law last year. So one takeaway, never try to declare martial law when you got 20% approval rating. Finally, we got a strong civil society. We have a strong opposition party. This is not Russia. This is not El Salvador. Our society has more than enough muscle to stop Trump. But the opposition can only win if it stays in the game. Democracies do not automatically defend themselves. People have to defend them. Authoritarians have to be beaten. That means that politicians, judges, CEOs, media owners, university presidents, law firms have to stand up and fight back, because no one has ever defeated an autocracy from the sidelines. I'll stop there. Thank you. Thanks. Questions, Dan? Who calls on the speakers?
We do have time for some questions. There will be a microphone here. And again, Greta will be roving with the other microphone. And if you have a comment instead of a question, you should buy a book and then talk about it after. Questions, please. Go ahead.
I wanted to ask, doesn't it usually take economic or cultural discomfort to the public to cause the actual action, the response? You know, I've always summarized the Conservative Party as you shouldn't have a social safety net, you shouldn't guarantee health care, but everybody should have a gun. What could possibly go wrong? And that it's been done that way. You know, it was that way in France before the revolution. It was that way in Spain before the revolution. It was that way in Russia before the revolution. So how does that end here? What does it take to get the people to feel it enough to take that action? Well, not necessarily revolution, but to fight back through some mechanism.
Tough question. I mean, I think the U.S. case is a lot different from 18th century France and from Russia and from Spain in the 30s, which is a very weak democracy with a weak rule of law. We have a lot of things going for us. And it's not, we're also a very, very polarized society. And it's pretty clear that it's going to take a lot to get the hardcore MAGA supporters, I would say roughly 35% of this country, to change. I think the economy could go very bad, even in their own personal lives, and it's still unlikely, at least in the short term, that they would abandon Trumpism. So there's about a 35% of the electorate that is likely to stay pretty hardcore MAGA in the short to medium run. But it doesn't take, you don't have to have 100% of society to turn things around. You need to have a solid majority. And mobilizing 55, 60, maybe 60+% of the society against Trumpism, that should be the goal, and that is attainable. You're absolutely right to suspect that, I mean, I don't want to root for an economic crisis, but probably an economic downturn would accelerate that process of getting to a 62% opposition majority. But Trump is helping. Trump is, his aggressiveness, I mean, it's stunning, but Trump has been more aggressively authoritarian than Hugo Chavez in his first year, more aggressively authoritarian than Orban in his first year, more aggressively authoritarian than Erdogan in his first year. That's scary. But he's also picking a lot of fights with a lot of people in a lot of places. And I think that's going to eventually accelerate opposition. So it's been slow. We would benefit much more if those with power and influence and prestige would speak out rather than cower under their desks. But I think there's a good chance the opposition comes. Again, we don't have to get to 100%. We have to get to 60, 65.
How do you see the role of propaganda in what we're seeing in America, and how do we fight back against media consolidation and propaganda?
Good question. We're in a very new world in terms of propaganda. So there are a couple of things going on. One is just this torrent of misinformation that you get through social media, that some individuals are exposed to almost exclusively through social media. And then there is this scary-looking packing of the private media. I mean, I have to say, I did not anticipate what has gone on with the Washington Post, CBS News, potentially CNN. We knew we had a billionaire, a right-wing billionaire controlling Fox News. And then we knew we had a right-wing billionaire controlling Twitter and X. But we didn't know a right-wing billionaire owning Washington Post would come around to acquiesce to Trump. We didn't know that a pro-Trump right-wing billionaire would get control of CBS News and potentially CNN, and that it may well be that TikTok ends up in the hands of billionaire friends of Trump. That packing of the media is much worse than I anticipated, but I think propaganda is going to be difficult in the United States. The kind of media blackout that you see in dictatorships, in Cuba or the Soviet Union or North Korea or even Russia or even Hungary, is really hard here because there's so many, thanks to online media, there's so many different media outlets, and so many Americans, at least 50%, if not 60%, who, one, have some resources and are actively seeking out other media sources. There is a big, huge, wealthy market. I was going to say thank God, but I won't. Thank goodness there is a huge market for critical media in this country, and that may be what saves us.
Hello. Thank you for an incredibly insightful lecture. Please bring your insight to this problem that I face in talking to many of my Republican friends, which is whataboutism. I will talk about what you have said, which is so obvious, the lawfare of the DOJ. And they will say, the DOJ under Biden did the same thing. There was the Hunter Biden laptop that wasn't covered. There was the pushback on Twitter about the misinformation about COVID. The last administration did the same thing. Trump is just fighting back. How do you handle that sort of thinking, that delusional thinking?
Probably by acknowledging what's real and separating it from what's not real. So, as you know very well, and I have the same experience, political argument, political debate in this polarized environment is really hard. People are really locked into their views. They're getting very different messages, very different information from different places, and they unfortunately believe different facts, and that's hard to argue with. I guess I have two responses. One, the the thing about whataboutism, and actually Jamel Bowie said something similar today, just because our guys did it, or just because somebody else did it, doesn't mean it's good. It's still bad, right? Two wrongs, even if there are two wrongs, they don't make a right. Two shots at two authoritarian power grabs don't make a democracy, right? It's never okay to do an authoritarian thing because somebody else might have done it. Second of all, it's worth acknowledging what has happened. There probably was a politicized effort to go after Trump in the Manhattan case for which he was convicted. He committed real crimes, but they were relatively minor, and they were crimes that others probably would not have been investigated and charged and convicted were they not Donald Trump. So I think that probably was a politicized investigation, not by Biden, but by the local prosecutors. That does not take away from the fact that the other things that Trump was charged with, trying to overturn an election and stealing away with classified documents, were not serious crimes, much more serious than anything that anybody's being charged with now. So acknowledging what was true is one way of separating the two, because it's even if you concede sort of the worst cases, they're not remotely comparable to what Trump did. I mean, Donald Trump attempted to overturn an election. That is the cardinal rule of democracy. The cardinal rule of democracy is that you have to accept results of election. He was the first incumbent president in the history of this republic to not accept the results of an election and try to overturn an election. There is no Democrat or no Republican anywhere else who has tried to do that. And so, yeah, and the other thing is, the Biden DOJ prosecuted, indicted Hunter Biden. And that's a pretty important contrast, for example, to what's happened with Tom Homer.
Okay, my question has to do with what is it that we need to do in the way of the pushback, because this is No King's Day. I and many others in the audience have participated in many protests, and I understand if maybe 3.5% of the population turn out to demonstrate in the streets, that would be 11 million people in today's protest. That is associated with studies that show that authoritarian wannabes fail. And there's the support of this organization, ACLU, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and there's the district judges that seem to have backbone. What do you recommend? What do you think it takes, and what do you think mainly about the No King's Day today? What is that going to make a difference?
Very, very important. So I'll circle back to that. First of all, we are fortunate, actually. We have three major channels through which to resist this authoritarian offensive. Not one of them alone is not going to be sufficient. We need to use all three. One is the courts. We continue to have independent courts, and they are going to be an important bulwark. They are not going to be perfect, and the Supreme Court has been deeply problematic. But the courts are an important way of slowing this down. We cannot rely on them alone. They're part of the solution. Elections are another critical solution. Ultimately, I still think the way we will defeat this authoritarian government is at the ballot box. However, we can't just sit around and wait, obviously, until November 2026 or 28. There's a lot that we need to do both in the courtroom and on the streets between now and then. The third thing that we have is avenues of civic protest. And that's not just No King's Day, although this is incredibly important. It's all sorts of civic protest. It is town halls. It is writing letters to your congressperson. It is organizing in all different ways. We don't know how and exactly when this authoritarian movement will be defeated, and so we have to press on all levers. The big three are the courts, elections, and citizens. What these massive protests can do, Erica Chenoweth is the person who came up with this 3.5% thing, and she's brilliant. She's my colleague at Harvard. She's great. I wouldn't hold my breath on the 3.5%. I think there's some problems with that analysis. But millions of Americans in the streets send a very important message. It sends a message to politicians who have been a little cowardly on both sides of the aisle, more than a little, I would say. It sends a message to judges. It is not true that judges are impartial referees who don't pay attention to politics and society and public opinion. They pay a lot of attention. There's a lot of evidence that they pay attention to the political winds. Well, 11 million people in the streets. How many million is it? Is it that many? 11 million people in the streets sends a powerful message. It also sends a message to citizens that they don't have to be afraid, that they can make a difference. So just to say one more thing, because I very often get this sort of what can we do question. It's a very important one. There are 1,000 different things we can do. There's no single strategy. There's no single organization. There's no single bullet. What we must do is participate. We must engage in politics one way or another. There are 1,000 different causes. There are 10,000 different groups that you can join. I don't want to say it doesn't matter at all which one it is, but you should work on the issue that you care most about. Be engaged, not just on Facebook, but be engaged and be involved. If there are not just 11 million, if there are 20, 30 million Americans who are engaged on issues of American politics and are pushing back when their time comes on their issue, that will make a difference. Again, the muscle is there. We are just underutilizing the muscle. So we've got to become part of that civil society muscle. Again, we don't know what strategy will work. Nobody ever imagined that protesting outside of Tesla dealerships would bring down Doge, but it kind of did. It's hard. In fact, it's impossible to know in advance what strategy will work. So what we have to do is be out there trying. We have to collectively be throwing a lot of spaghetti at the wall, and something will stick.
That is all the time we have for questions. So one more hand for our speaker.
Thank you so much.